So the topic that we're going to talk about today are trends in information security. Thank you very much for having me today. This is my information a little bit. I know I was just introduced, but for those who did not hear, I'll give you a quick background. I'm in the information security space for quite some time, consulted in the space, invented various products. Currently, I'm the CEO of a company that just put out its first product, which is an engine that warns people if they're making inappropriate social media posts. It's a B2B product, so that businesses don't get harmed by employees leaking data and the like. I write a column, as was mentioned before. It's currently carried by Inc., previously by syndicated to several other venues, and my pieces appear in various other areas, including you'll find some interesting pieces that I've written on the Simplilearn website. One thing I should begin with, it is holiday season. Simplilearn, which is the firm that sponsored today's webinar, has agreed to give participants half off any course that they register from after this webinar on security. This is highly unusual. Typically, you'll find coupons 10, 20%. Half off is a really nice holiday gift, so if you're looking at taking a formal course, if you're looking to do CISP certification or the like, this may be a good time. So write down this code and take a look at the website afterwards. And I apologize, I have a little cold, so hopefully I'm still clear. We're going to look at trends in information security, and by trends I don't mean what the latest fads are. I mean how we got to where we are and where we're going. Different big picture elements in future webinars, and this will be a series of webinars which may drill down more in detail on some of the things. But we're also going to look at excuse me, how human error and human weaknesses are contributing to things that shouldn't be problems anymore, remaining big problems and the like. So if we want to understand cybersecurity and cyber attacks and trends related to these, we need to understand cyber attacks in general. And the first question is, why are people doing them and who is doing them? So when we talk about why, there's an old saying in the United States, why does somebody rob a bank? Because that's where the money is. And it's true in the cyber world as well. People who are attacking sites are doing so because there's a reason to go to those sites. Either it's money or it's data or it's some other reason, but there's some reason that they're doing it in order to achieve a goal that they have with typically less risk than they would have if they did it in the physical world. Robbing a bank, going into the bank with a gun is typically a lot more risky for people than trying to steal money online, for example. Who is doing this? And this is a very important point when it comes to trends, and this impacts many other trends. You can see the picture from the movie War Games in the top right. That's the early 1980s. In those days, it was kids playing around. The pre-commercialization of the internet, it was kids trying to prove their technical skills or are curious and the like. Over time, we have hacktivists defacing websites. We have criminals starting to enter the world of cyber, and usually it's individuals or small groups. But today we've graduated, and we have organized crime doing this. We have nation states doing this. We have terrorist groups doing this. So we're talking about a whole different set of actors, and that has a tremendous impact on information security, both from a defense and an offensive perspective. The parties who are doing the worst breaches today, the parties that are causing the biggest headaches for businesses and individuals from a defense standpoint, are not looking to demonstrate their technical knowledge. They're looking to achieve aims. And in many cases, deniability is important. They want to achieve those aims with nobody knowing that they're the ones who did it. Very different than the early hacking. Also, as a result of this, attacks may not be totally technological in nature. Somebody may social engineer an employee with a phone call and then use information that they gained from that to do something technological. Someone may try to physically enter a building and then exploit something. We're talking about a blend of technologies because you're dealing with much more sophisticated parties. I should say a blend of attack mechanisms. As technology has advanced, we've also seen another change, which is today, your firewall in your organization is not the first or second generation of firewall. We've had, dozens of generations of technology in the defense perspective, but we're still on human version 1.0. And so while you still will see technological exploits utilized, very, very often we're seeing that the human is the first step into the organization. Excuse me. And in fact, because technologies are better, many times when breaches are going to involve technological stuff, they involve multiple what we call zero-day exploits. So exploits where the vulnerability was not known to the public at the time that it was exploited, in which no patch or no fix was available. Another important point to realize, and this is something that I've been speaking about for many years, but it's becoming more and more of a clear concept and definitely a trend. The trend is towards trying to steal data, in many cases more than trying to steal money directly. And this is a result of several factors. The first one is that when money disappears from someone's account, they know about it. So if somebody steals $1 million from a bank account, there's no way to have the party who had the money stolen not know about it over a long period of time. I shouldn't say there's no way. It's very, very difficult to get the balance dropped. On the other hand, if somebody copies data from a server that they weren't supposed to access to, the original data remains. And so the party that was breached may not know that the data was stolen and may never know that the data was stolen. So there's a lot greater chance of A, getting away with it, and B, being able to take action that the victim doesn't know that they need to defend against. The other thing is that financial institutions and online large online venues for shopping, online retailers, use all sorts of anti-fraud technologies to detect fraudulent transactions and financial leaks and the like, which makes it a lot less easy to get away with these types of crimes than simply copying data. Let's talk about some of the newer threats. And these aren't necessarily new, but they're on the newer end, and they're part of trends that we need to be aware of. So we see the keyword APT, Advanced Persistent Threats, a lot. And again, at a high level, what this refers to is parties that are advanced. So these are sophisticated parties, nation states, criminal organizations that are well-funded, and they are persistent. And by persistent, what we mean is that they're not opportunistic. I'm not going out there, if I'm an APT attacker, and saying, hey, I'm just interested in stealing credit cards in general. And wherever I can get them, I'm going to get them. These people are typically targeting specific parties for specific reasons. My goal is to breach Company X and cause problems for Company X or steal Company X's information. Not so much my goal is to get information. And these are threats because these are intent on doing something bad. So you have someone who's sophisticated, wants to do something bad, has the capability of doing it, and is persistent to do it until they achieve it. Early examples where the term was used would be Stuxnet and Operation Aurora. These were major breaches. Stuxnet in Iran. Operation Aurora was believed to be trying to attack various U.S. businesses. But the point is that the actors were intent on harming a specific party or breaching a specific party for specific reasons. Very often these parties are exploiting multiple mechanisms, including zero-day attacks, and almost always relying on human error somewhere in the process. An offspring of this concept is that we now have the ability to, and when I say we, I don't mean me personally, I'm saying we as a society have the ability to execute all sorts of sophisticated attacks against both corporations and individuals. These things could be used to wreck someone's life by stealing their pictures and information and leaking it, as we've seen in certain situations, and they could be used for industrial espionage. So this is definitely, the APT is becoming, or has been, and is continuing to be a significant aspect. I mean, if you think about the Sony breach not that long ago, that was an example of what might happen from an APT. What's interesting is that we've forgotten major lessons from the physical world, and that's part of what's caused this problem. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So many times malware that gets used in part of some sophisticated attacks is delivered because someone was downloading something for free or got an email, hey, here's some free pictures of something or free video. There's no such thing as free. If somebody's offering something for free, there's a reason for it, and sometimes that's malicious. Likewise, we have people who are using cloud services and have no idea whatsoever about the security of the vendor and the provider that they're using, which again doesn't make very much sense when you're dealing with sophisticated technology. And of course we have people communicating with websites that they know may be run by criminal parties because there's something on the site that they want, either super discounted item or you've got something that's given away for free. You don't want to be doing that. What's interesting is that even when it comes to USB drives and plugging your phones into chargers, we see very little security being practiced in many situations. You have businesses that will disable USB ports, But you have many people who will borrow a USB drive without thinking about it, or will plug their phone into a borrowed charger without thinking about the fact that they're now plugging something into what's usually the communication port of the device. In the 1980s, they used to say, don't put floppy drives into your computer if you don't know that those drives are, the disks have not been in computers with viruses. But today, somehow that concept seems to have been weakened. Maybe because we have such good endpoint security solutions and antivirus solutions, people rely on the technology to work, and that doesn't always happen. This could end up becoming a model also for biological attacks, just like Stuxnet was a custom piece of, for example, to affect certain centrifuges that the Iranians were using, and not to do damage to other systems, even though it would propagate through them. Potentially there could be biological weapons to attack people with certain forms of DNA and the like. This is just an interesting point. Ransomware is a trend that doesn't seem to be disappearing. It's a problem, I should say, that doesn't seem to disappear, and it's certainly part of a trend. And we're going to talk about this in advanced ransomware in a minute, but the point is that ransomware is where somebody gets some malware on a computer or pretends to have malware on a computer that says that if you don't pay them money, they're going to delete your files or delete some of your files, corrupt your files, and the like. In order for this to get installed, someone almost always has to make a mistake and let the malware get onto the machine. We now see a trend towards data leaking on social media, and obviously I'm in this space, so I see this all the time. These things have led to things such as kidnappings and what we call virtual kidnappings. That's where someone pretends to have kidnapped a relative, but the relative is unable to be reached at the time, so you can't verify that they have the relative or don't, and therefore you may pay the ransom. I did a piece on CNBC about this. This is actually a big problem in many major cities today. You've got information leaking on social media that's also leading to spear phishing attacks. Okay, and obviously classic data loss prevention, sitting at the firewall or scanning the cloud, is not going to do anything if somebody is leaking data on a social media account on a weekend from a personal device while at a party. Excuse me. Smart devices. We'll talk about this here and also in relation to embedded systems. Smart devices, which we all have on our phones, and we've all got all sorts of smart devices that we may have purchased for our homes or business. These things are really internet computers that are doing all sorts of other functions. In many ways, they're the internet of me. If you're wearing a Fitbit or a Jawbone or some sort of other health tracking device that's got all sorts of information about you, transmitting it by Bluetooth to your phone and then syncing to a server, all this kind of information is very valuable to criminals. The proliferation of these devices is obviously leading to possibilities of stealing the data and the like. Embedded systems. Every car today sold in America has got computers in it. In fact, we think of them as cars, but we don't think about them as computers with wheels and a steering wheel and the like. But this actually has big consequences because these computers are potentially hackable, and that could be dangerous. Has there been malware found to be on cars yet? Not yet, but we have had hacking going on. So these are things that, as the market produces more and more Internet of Things devices, you're going to see a trend toward security issues there. And that brings us to extreme ransomware. Imagine somebody driving a vehicle and the ransomware doesn't say, I'm going to encrypt your data. It says, I'm going to crash your car if you don't pay me. That's a very, very serious threat. Or with a pacemaker. Someone has a smart pacemaker, and if you don't, ransomware says, hey, you need to pay me or I'm going to do something to your pacemaker and it's going to kill you. Is this science fiction or real world? Well, I'll let you judge for yourself. This article is actually from several years ago already about a smart pacemaker that would transmit information over a network so doctors could monitor it. And of course, if the information were corrupted by a hacker along the way, that could lead to bad things. And as we have devices that are embedded in us physically or in hospitals that receive signals over a network, there's obviously more risk. This is a piece from this year about a hacker who managed to stop a vehicle remotely while it was being driven. So this is not science fiction. These are real issues, and you can't buy security software for your car today. You're relying on the vendor to get things right. But there are issues, and this is just from a few months ago. So obviously there's going to be a trend towards dealing with these security issues as time goes on. Part of the problem has been psychological. We don't view embedded systems as computers. We view them as devices. We had cars 20 years ago that had no computers. We just see a car with more function, and that creates all these kinds of issues. The same thing with mobile phones. Obviously, there's been a lot of security talk and a lot of security development about phones, but the fundamental issue has not changed, which is that we don't approach these types of devices properly. We all have smartphones, but actually none of us have smartphones. There's no such thing as a smartphone. What you have is a pocket computer that has an app on it that does phone service, or does voice communications, but actually 99% of the time you're not using it for that function. The reason we call it a smartphone is that when we had regular cell phones and smartphones came out, the cell providers wanted you to upgrade. And if they said, well, why don't you get rid of your dumb phone and get a pocket computer, you probably would say no. But if they said, hey, why don't you trade in your dumb phone for a smartphone, that sounds very, very nice. But in actuality, these are not phones. They're full-blown computers, and they need full-blown security, and they need the attitude of full-blown security. And we just don't approach that as a society, even though these computers are actually far more risky than desktops were 20 years ago or even 15 years ago. And those machines, we had antivirus, or we had all sorts of earlier versions of security software for, but we just don't think of these things in our pockets in the framework that we do. And I should say that people on this call may, but the general society does not. So we're talking about permanently network-connected devices with lots of sensitive data that are communicating over insecure protocols to other things such as earlier versions of Bluetooth, and yet people don't treat them with the sophistication that they need. Privacy is another area where there are major trends. In fact, as we're talking now, there's discussions in Europe about changing legislation. It may get much stricter. The age of consent on websites may go from 13 to 16, etc. But the point is you're going to see major trends because everybody's tracking everything all the time, and that leads to privacy violations. And there's a trend on both sides of the Atlantic towards improving the security, I should say privacy for individuals. You're going to see this trend. You're going to see laws probably pop out in Europe and the U.S. and the rest of the world, but you're going to see this for sure in 2016, and we may even see changes yet in the remainder of 15. Authentication attacks are something that have gone on for a long time and will continue to go on for a long time, but I want to talk about a little bit how we got here and what forms of authentication we've been using so we can observe a trend that's going on right now. Obviously, passwords are an old form of authentication. We've all used them. We've used them too much. In fact, passwords have been used successfully for thousands of years before the computer age. Now we know they're insufficient, and we've had government bodies point out. So why are they failing now? Well, if you think about the early years of human society, passwords often were used in life and death situations. A knight shows up at the castle, presents the password to get in. If the person doesn't get in, they're likely to be killed. You're not going to forget a password. If your life depends on it, you're going to practice it, memorize it, know it, that you can say it even in your sleep. Furthermore, you probably didn't have many passwords like that. Even 20 years ago, how many passwords did the typical person have? Maybe they had a home alarm. A student at school may have had a locker combination, but not very much more than that. So before the commercialization of the Internet in the mid-90s, you probably had a very, very small number of passwords. Maybe those of us who used bulletin boards before and the like had a few, but it was a very, very small number compared to today. And so even complex passwords could be committed to memory. You also didn't have many chances to get it right. That night at that castle is not going to be able to reset or say they forgot it or push a button to have it reset by email or anything like that. They got to get it right the first time. There was also very little risk of interception. When you went to your locker and put in the code on your combination lock, you knew it was your combination lock and the device transmitting the password to somebody else. Same with your home alarm. That's not necessarily true of the Internet today, where you have the possibility that things could be intercepted along the way. And even when you had two parties that needed to present passwords, they would have what we used to see in all the spy movies, some sort of secret handshake to indicate that they should be trusted to each other and the like. You had mechanisms that worked because there weren't that many that you had to know. In the computer era, we've got way too many passwords. Users, in many cases, don't care about some of those passwords. You've got websites that have absolutely no significant security value to anybody other than the site itself. So, for example, sites where you read articles, but you have an account and you have to log in. So unless you're making comments and stuff or you're editing stuff, it really makes no difference to you whether you're compromised on that, yet they're still asking you in many cases to make these fancy passwords. And that obviously undermines the whole concept of passwords. On this call, I probably don't need to explain to many people why this wallet-sized password list, keeping written down passwords is a problem, but yet there are templates like this online, even in 2015, and the descriptions, which you can see here, say, use this so you can remember them because they're too hard. So there's been approaches that the first trend was towards these really long and contorted passwords with special characters in uppercase. Research, and I wrote a piece about this for Forbes last year, research shows that this does not work very well. As passwords get too long, people repeat characters. We know that statistically, when you require upper, lower, and special, almost always the upper is in the first character, then the lower, then the special, and or the number. There's a lot of things that we can do with sophisticated analysis that make these passwords a lot weaker than they are in theory. This is one of the problems that also happens. People can't remember them, they put post-its. I personally like long passwords when they're created out of multiple words with numbers separating them. The word Simplilearn 7 Steinberg for chocolate is a pretty strong password, and it is easier to remember, at least for me, than the password that appeared on that post-it note. But in any case, the industry trended towards stronger authentication. First concept was challenge questions. I consider challenge questions to be a move in the wrong direction. To me, challenge questions, and I've been writing about them for years, are just simply weak passwords. Instead of asking you for a random password, I'm asking you for a password and telling the world that, for example, what color is your first car, that the answer is going to be a color, and it's going to be a color that's used for cars. Eliminating nearly all possibilities for what the password could be. And I also know that the chances are pretty good, for example, in the United States, that if you have a large database and you ran the color red against the database, you're going to have hits. So instead of having a random password, now I have an incredibly weak password. So I never liked challenge questions, and in the era of social media, they've become almost worthless, and in fact hurt security, because we train people to answer questions when they shouldn't be answering the questions. If I walked up to you and said, "What's your mother's maiden name?" you probably would not answer me if I didn't know you. Forget, websites do this all the time, and in many cases you can find this on social media. Several years ago, American Express, for example, asked people their mother's birthday as a challenge question. They no longer do this. In the era of social media, that would not work. And I should say they did stop it before social media became popular. But someone puts on social media celebrating my mom's birthday, that's not going to work. Anyone can find it if it's publicly readable. But think about mother's maiden name. If you go through someone's Facebook friends, the most common last name is probably their own. Second most common last name of their friend. If they have a group called family, or they're talking about a family event, that's probably their mother's maiden name, because it's probably cousins on that side. So these are very, very weak issues in the era of social media. Strong authentication. We've seen all sorts of tokens and biometrics. These work really well inside of an office. The problem is that when these things get transmitted across the internet, you have the problem of interception. If your thumbprint is intercepted, you can't reset it. So there's tremendous risk if that ever needs to be used again. And of course, the person doing the intercepting is probably going to try using it for all sorts of nefarious purposes. So there are risks related to these things, but in some cases they do present advantages. One of the other areas is site-to-user authentication. We almost never think about this because we type in URLs and we go there, and we don't think about the fact that the site could be fake. But obviously there is spear phishing and phishing that go on. Those of us on the call may check that the SSL certificate's valid. There may be identity keys or something on the site to tell us it's legit. But whatever the case may be, the vast majority of people certainly do not do a good job verifying, whether it's a site, an email, or whomever that's communicating with them, that the party is legitimate. And in fact, this brings us to another human lesson related to phishing, which is that for some reason people trust things that are in writing to be true. It's the same reason why ridiculous facts, quote-unquote facts, can be posted on social media and people will believe them and spread them without verifying them. They're in writing, they're by a computer. When a computer presents you an email that says, "Buy Apple stock," people give it a certain greater value than if someone just walked up to them on the street. And they also think that it's the computer telling them. If I send you an email and you get an email from me, does that mean that it's really from me, or is it your computer telling you that it's from me? It's not really from me. It's passed through many, many systems along the way. So unless it's digitally signed and has some proof that it's from me, you need to have some sort of skepticism, especially if it's saying something strange, such as the email in front of you right now. Unfortunately, we've seen some poor approaches to this. Many of us are familiar with, for example, pictures that were put on websites that were supposed to prove the authenticity of the site. In some cases, they actually ask you challenge questions before presenting pictures which condition people to do the wrong thing. But there are all sorts of ways around this. Those are starting to disappear. But you'll read, if you would like, you can go to my website. You'll find a white paper I wrote in 2006 why this doesn't work. But the point is that bad approaches are often taken to authentication issues, and they get deployed, and the problems remain. And that's why we're still dealing with phishing, for example, more than a decade after people thought the problem would go away. There are systems that train people to recognize phishing emails. There are queues that can be put on sites that prevent phishing and the like. But the trend is away from some of these technologies that don't work. The trend is away from challenge questions and other things that don't work and make things worse. And of course, I should mention that typically people being phished are going to be in, I don't want to state of panic, but a state of concern because there's something urgent in the email. So for example, a message from a CISO, a spear phishing email impersonating a CISO, telling somebody, hey, I need you to reset a certain password for a system. Please call me. If you don't get me, and you try me a few times and you don't get me, it's because I'm on a flight. So just do it anyway, this one time. And of course, the person sending that phishing email saw on social media that CISO had posted that they're getting on a flight. Very effective spear phishing email, and the person's in a panic because they report to the CISO, and the CISO had said it's urgent to do something. And there are many other examples of a similar nature. Distributed denial of service attacks continue to be an issue. I wrote a piece recently about Inc. about some of the technological changes that are occurring with relation to them and the attackers and the mechanisms that they're using for it. But these remain a problem because taking down a site has all sorts of reasons. Hacktivists try to take down sites, deface them or take them down. A competing business may want a site to be taken down if they're not scrupulous, and certainly foreign governments at times have reasons to take down sites. You have people who are attacking ISIS-related accounts. For better or for worse, those things are being taken down. Sometimes we wonder, that really helps because the government might be monitoring those accounts, and now new accounts that the government doesn't know about could be set up. But whatever the case may be, these types of distributed denial of service attacks almost always involve mass deployments of malware so that they can create zombie machines around the world to perform these attacks. If people would not fall prey to things that got malware into their machines, distributed denial of service attacks would be a lot more complicated and difficult to execute. Data leakage has been a real problem over the last few years. Sometimes it's through a hacker going in and taking the data, and we mentioned earlier that data can be more valuable than money at times, and sometimes it's been the result of employee errors, and the employees leak it directly, and sometimes it's intentional, such as the Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning cases. But the point here is that data leakage can be catastrophic for a business or for someone's career. If you think about Sony, there were people who had to resign and lost their jobs. If you think about the Target breach, a similar story. High-ranking people who had to leave as a result of hacks that were successful and data leaking and data being stolen. And I'm considering all of those related. And the point here is that you really need to protect your data as if it's worth more than money, because it probably is. And as I mentioned earlier, we're finding now that data is starting to leak on social media, not by people sending out spreadsheets, but by people saying things that then help criminals execute attacks. What's interesting here is that there are so many errors that are made when it comes to many of these types of breaches, any one of which could have potentially made the situation much better. If you think about the government and WikiLeaks, you're talking about Edward Snowden having access to large amounts of information that he may not necessarily have needed to have access to do his job. In the case of Manning, you had a private in the United States Army who had access to all sorts of unencrypted diplomatic cables. Highly questionable why he needed access to those for his job. The reality is that many times when there are massive data leaks, we find out after the fact that certain principles of information security weren't applied. People had access to things that they shouldn't have, stuff was stored unencrypted, and the like. And the point is, you need a layered defense. And that's the same thing when it comes to advanced persistent threats. We can't rely on the fact today that that super-duper firewall and perimeter defense mechanisms and intrusion detection that you've got at the external DMZ and everything are going to defend against everything. If someone is, especially in the case of an advanced persistent attacker, you may have someone who makes it in, and you need to assume that. So you need all sorts of technology to address that type of risk and contain the damage. There may be some damage, but you want to contain it. You could also have technology, for example, that looks for anomalous stuff going on the network. In the case of Sony, you had huge amounts of data being transmitted out to a system that it shouldn't have been transmitted out to. So maybe you're detecting, hey, all of a sudden there's this large volume I need to act, and the like. So data loss prevention, anomaly detection, social media scanning for things that shouldn't have ever made it out the door. All these types of things can give you a better picture of what's going on and contain the defense. And obviously encryption and giving people only what they need access to. The cloud is obviously here to stay, and there are cloud attacks that were going on several years ago, but we're not done with this problem. And part of it is that people don't always realize how much valuable data sits out there. Businesses, many large businesses do, and they have all sorts of deals with these providers for security and the like. But the reality is that, we are giving that third-party entities things to watch that are incredibly valuable to us, and we probably wouldn't give them some of these things if we didn't understand the consequences. The obvious example of this on an individual level was all the nude pictures that leaked of celebrities last year, where stuff had been synced up to the cloud and then the data stolen from the cloud potentially, or other examples where that's been happening. And again, it may have been weak passwords on the part of the celebrity, but that's irrelevant. The point is the data lived in the cloud, sometimes even after it was deleted on local machines or local devices. People don't necessarily realize what they're sending out to the cloud. That creates all sorts of risks. And of course, one of the things to keep in mind is if there is a breach, if you're simply an individual or a small business, are you really going to be the first priority of that vendor who's dealing with big company data leaking, is dealing with potential shutdown of their business potentially? Who knows what could happen? So you need to understand that. And the third-party risk is another major aspect of a trend that's going on because our infrastructure doesn't rely on a single party anymore. We have internal appliances that may come from third parties. We're using third-party processing services. We're using third-party accounting services. We're using third-party communication services and the like. A breach at a third party or a failure at a third party could directly impact our own information security. Right? It was believed that Target was breached because something went wrong at an air conditioning repair contractor from their information security perspective. We had a case recently where I think it was an Experian case, where it wasn't the fault of the provider that had data go out, but it was a fault of a customer or of a third party associated with them that data ended up leaking. And you can read articles about this in the media regularly. So understanding and ensuring that your third parties that you're doing business with have proper information security has become absolutely critical. Sometimes this is through agreements. Sometimes it actually needs to be done through audits. And at other times, it's helping them with their information security because the investment is well worth it for yourself. One other important concept is that big brand does not equal great security. It could, but it's not always the case. Many times a party needs a certain type of information security product, and they have some specific needs, and they say, listen, the big brand meets most of it. Everyone's buying the big brand, but the reality is that their needs aren't fully met by it, and they would be better met by a small company, but they're worried that that small company is small, not on a preferred vendor list or what's going to happen with them. But you need to understand that as part of that risk, criminals don't care what brand you buy. This isn't like buying computers where if you buy the brand name, it may cost more, but they'll work the same. This is a case where if you don't address the risk, criminal is going to at some point probably exploit that risk. So that's the end of the slides. If anybody has questions, I'm going to take them in a moment, but you can also contact me on Twitter if you want to discuss this presentation. That's my Twitter handle, and you can ask me questions about this or what have you, talk about security, and I do post security articles pretty much every day, interesting things either from myself or other writers, so feel free to follow and you'll see some interesting things. Again, I want to remind everybody that for people watching the webinar, the sponsor has given us a 50% off coupon for training courses in security. This is not a discount that they normally offer. As I said, you'll see 10 and 20% from time to time. 50% is a great deal. If you're thinking of taking the CISSP exam, for example, or other exams, take a look at the courses. This is probably going to be the time where you're going to be able to get the greatest deal this holiday season, and I think this code is going to be valid for another week or so. It's not going to be lasting indefinitely, so I would take a look soon. And with that, I'll open the floor up to questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, there's one question which is from Vinith, and I'm just pasting that question on the chat box. Can you see that?
The question that was posed is, can end-to-end encryption be the answer to all security questions? And the answer is no. End-to-end encryption is a nice thing for certain forms of communication, but it doesn't solve many issues. If an organization is breached, for example, someone on the inside, a hacker on the inside, could be leveraging those same communication channels and do a lot of damage. They may get the data after it's ultimately decrypted. Remember, to utilize data, you ultimately need to decrypt it, with the exception of things when you're comparing encrypted strings. So if I'm, got end-to-end communication for some sort of commerce, at some point I need to decrypt it and process it. If there's a criminal on those systems, they have access to it. If there's a criminal in memory where the encryption, decryption is taking place, they could cause problems. And of course, none of that is going to address many of the risks of information leakage. There's certain data that by law has to remain confidential. There's certain data that may have problems that may be leaked in fashions that has nothing to do with the primary channel. A person, for example, on social media may make a post and talk about, a customer they have, may talk about a financial account, may talk about medical stuff that may violate a law, may talk about a potential merger. Who knows what could have you? As long as there are people in the process, that remains an issue as well. And the reality is that encryption is an important part of the information security process, but no one technology, no one approach, no one technique addresses all risks.
Joseph, there's another 3 questions which is pending on the chat. I've just copied and pasted.
Okay, I'm just looking at them. There was one question about the WikiLeaks incident, so I'm not going to go into the whole story that happened there, but you did have an American soldier who leaked information that he had access to at the time, and one of the questions that came up is why an American soldier had access, for example, to diplomatic cables. There were diplomatic cables, transmissions between United States diplomats that were unencrypted and available to this particular party. And one of the things that we should mention is that there's always this back and forth and pull and push between the idea of information sharing and information security. So after 9/11, there was a major effort in the United States to make sure that the government facilitated information sharing between different groups. So if there was a security threat that the Navy heard about, the Army needs to know about it soon. If the FBI discovered something, people in the military would have access to it. If the diplomats discovered something, potentially the right people would need to have it in the CIA. But they may have gone overboard, or they may never have actually had a better system to begin with, and maybe they were always sharing too much of this kind of stuff. But the point is that you had people who had access to information that was highly sensitive, who probably had no business having access to it. So when a private in the military can get unencrypted diplomatic cables, you run a risk. Remember, the more people you have, the greater risk you have that one of them may turn out to be rogue, or may turn out to have some sort of psychological issue or what have you that may lead to something going wrong. So if all of a sudden, you have 1 million people having access to something sensitive, the risk of it leaking or something happening to it are much greater than if you had, 10 people having access to it. It's not just who, it's also just the sheer statistics and probability. So the importance of making sure people have access to everything that they need in order to do their jobs, but not giving them access to sensitive things that they don't need to, was highlighted by those particular incidents and other incidents that we've seen as well. Somebody had asked about IBM and the operating systems. I mentioned IBM because in the United States there was a saying in the old days that nobody got fired for buying IBM, meaning even if IBM servers and computer equipment cost more money than some other vendors, especially in the early eras of personal computers when you have what they called clones, in that era it may have cost less to buy something else, but nobody got fired for buying IBM and spending a little bit more money because you were retaining a certain known quality. Whereas if you had bought a no-name brand that had copied the IBM and something went wrong, someone would ask, well, why didn't you buy the IBM machine? And the point there was that, yes, there's a time where people may want to buy a brand or buy a better quality as long as both work. But when it comes to information security technology, you got to make sure you have a technology that actually solves the problem that you have. Once you've done a risk assessment and the like, and you know what countermeasures are available, what you need to do, Just saying I'm going to buy the thing that everybody else bought because my problem is similar to what I think everybody else's problem is, even though I don't know for sure, that's not a good approach. You need to make sure that you actually address all the risks that you're worried about. And criminals will find a way to exploit the fact that if you addressed 80% of the risks that you have, those 20 are going to be the ones that they're going to get you on. It's not a case of, or 99 and 1, you can probably have the same concept. It's not a case of a checklist of brand. It's a matter of addressing all the necessary risks. What is the best way to secure from ransomware? So that is a great question. There are a couple things that I advise people to do. First of all, when it comes to ransomware on computers, if you back up frequently and you keep those backups disconnected from the computer, then even if a machine got ransomware and someone said, I'm going to steal all your data, you could take that data that's backed up and use it on another machine. You really don't have the same kind of risk that you would if you don't have another copy of the data. Do not keep the backup connected to the machine, because if the backup is connected to the machine, it could also potentially get infected, or the ransomware may encrypt stuff in the backup too. It's just, it could be another drive or what have you. So keep it separated. That's number one. Number two, ransomware is delivered as malware. Ransomware comes on because somebody made a mistake. They clicked something that they shouldn't. They did something. They went to a website that offered, free movies and or the like, that some pirated movies, what have you. Don't do that. If people don't do that and they stick with good information security practices, the odds that they're going to get malware go down. So there's that proactive thing. Try to prevent the malware, but have a defense that even if malware did get onto your machine, you're not going to lose it. You're not going to lose your data because you have it on another machine. You can switch the computer, either clean the computer or otherwise deal with it. The other thing to think about is that when it comes to malware, that we will have these more advanced forms of malware down the line that could be serious risks, as I mentioned, with cars or medical devices. There's really very little at this point that an individual can do about those things other than, ask when you buy something like that in manufacturers, is there something being done to make sure that this device is secure? So in those types of cases, you may want to ask. There have been vulnerabilities found in these types of things. Typically, when they hit the media, they're going to be quickly fixed, right? The cheap thing led to a big discussion in the media and the like. So hopefully over time, those things will be addressed because of the significant risk to it. But I would expect that eventually we're going to see some sort of security technology to address those in the Internet of Things and smart devices as well. Can we implement DKIM to avoid spoofing or email? So the answer is that there are technologies that help protect against phishing, domain keys and the like, and all sorts of other forms of technology to authenticate email. The question is, though, do they work for individuals who are using it? Do they work for the people? And there have been all sorts of complexities in terms of getting people to actually use this. People are using handhelds to send email. They're going home and sending email. If you can really do that, and that typically will work more in a closed organization, that would work great. And in that case, at least you would know if the CISO sent you an email that it really came from the CISO. But remember that social engineering takes other forms too. A text message could come in. Person could say, hey, I lost my phone, so I'm sending it from my wife's phone or what have you on a trip, and I'm about to get on the plane. You really can't rely on the technology to address human risks. You really need to address the human risks also by training the people and having technology warn them when they're doing something wrong. Because just relying on a technology that will technologically, block things is, or technologically sign things, and then the human is expected to interpret that, doesn't always work perfectly, because you can't guarantee that 100% of attacks will always utilize mechanisms that would be checked by the technology. And so as a last question, I will take this question here. How are the tools in the InfoSec space keeping up with the growth of all of those threats that we've discussed today? Great question. So there are constantly new products that come out. There are constantly new versions of products. I mentioned, for example, the advanced persistent threats. In the last few years, we've seen a whole slew of products that look for anomalous behavior on internal networks to a much greater extent than we've had in the past, and that's because people are worried that, hey, even if I defend the perimeter, someone who's persistent may get inside, and once they're inside, I don't want the whole, everything to go wrong. I want to be able to detect that there's something strange, that all of a sudden, the CFO's machine is sending out all the spreadsheets on the drive, all over the world, and I want to block that. So you've got all these things that will detect anomalies that have come in. Obviously, I'm in the space dealing with social media data leaks. That wasn't a problem a few years ago. Now it's a serious problem. We have more and more younger people entering the workforce who use social media a lot more, so we've got a lot more people who are used to oversharing, and we've got businesses spending more time on social media because younger generation now has money to spend, and they want to get that money and get them to buy stuff. So, risk gets created, so we've entered that space. You have companies that have entered the phishing space to help train people because there's been this concept that, hey, these pictures on the website isn't fully doing the job. You've got a technology actually now I was involved with creating that uses psychologically sound cues on sites that works better than pictures and hopefully reduces the number of people that create mistakes, make mistakes and fall prey to scam. That was called Green Armor, and you can still find that, and that's in use in many banks now and healthcare companies. So you'll find different technologies that get created and put out there to address things, but in the end, it's a constantly evolving world. Risks are detected, and technologies come out, and people are trying to get around them from a criminal perspective. But in general, humans are still going to be an important facet of information security, and you can't upgrade the human brain. You can train people, you can condition people, but you still need to deal with the fact that humans do make errors, and so you need technology that's going to address that. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'm going to be giving a series of webinars talking about other information security topics, perhaps drilling down more in detail on some of the concepts that we spoke about today. So go and you can check my Twitter feed. I always announce them on that feed, and the Simplilearn website. And again, go look at the site now if you're looking for any courses, because this discount that they are providing of 50% is something that's not going to last, and I would take advantage of that if you're looking for a course. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day.
Joseph, sorry to interrupt you. Participants, if you do have any questions, I would kindly request you to log into Simplilearn forum, and you can post your question there, and one of our trainer or the expertise or our speaker will answer your questions within 24 to 48 hours. All right? Because due to the time consumption, we will not be able to cover up all the questions. So I would kindly request each and every participant to get into the Simplilearn forum. It's an open forum, and request you all to post your questions there, and our expertise or the trainer or the speakers will answer your questions within 24 hours. All right. So thank you so much, participants, and thank you, Joseph. Thank you so much. And is there anything else that you would like to share with the participants?
I was just going to say thank you, everybody, for listening in today. There'll be more webinars. You'll find them on the Simplilearn website. You'll find them on my Twitter feed, and I hope we'll speak again soon in the near future.
So the webinar will be ending another minute. The webinar will get ended. All right. Thank you so much, participants.